Okay. So, all right, we are recording now. So this is kind of the agenda. Like I said before, I like it to be very interactive. So if you have any questions or want to share, just go ahead. So I'm just going to cover some of the basics of how you get teams, a large number of teams up and running, and the organizational structure and the people you need to do that based on my experience. And then to do that, we have to talk about organizational design, because a lot of what we do in Agile transformation or Agile adoption is organization change. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll talk about some notions of how to implement an Agile organization, because that goes along with what we're going to talk about, onboarding teams and teams of teams. We'll talk about this notion of an ambidextrous organization, and then we'll go through some examples. Is that okay with everyone? So this is me. I've been in the business for many, many years. I've worked at some exciting companies and coded some exciting stuff. I think I've worn many hats. BA, project manager, one of the early adopters of Scrum and Agile and XP. Been doing it for, I don't know, 20 something years now. So I really like it, and I still do it. So that's me. So let's talk about teams and this approach. I would say, first of all, there's nothing magical about this, and there's no one size fits all. Okay, but I have noticed over the years, not just based on my experience, but other people's experiences and conversations with them, and that there's a pattern that's emerged out there, um, to get functional areas or groups or organizations uh, up and running, which is basically the teams of teams. Generally, the first thing we do as we're looking at changes, we have to assess the current state and assess their readiness. Are they serious? All people's involved, especially the executives, about going down this journey. And I always indicate that this is going to be a bumpy road. Okay, there's going to be a lot of it inspect and adaptation and so forth as we go along. And this is a lot of organizational change, people change, and so forth, which adds a level of complexity and and basically uneasiness through and tension through this whole process. So I'm very open and honest about this. And it doesn't have to be agile, it could be digital transformation, it could be any kind of massive change that you're going to take the organization and the people through. So the first thing we do focus on is org change. Who's the executives. We'll talk about some examples where I've done before where we had C-level uh, support. And then we developed what we call a target organizational design and a target operating model. And sometimes, many times, we have to go through transitional kind of organizational designs and structures before we get to the target. And depending upon the size of what you're doing, it could take a while. So I notice more success happens if we do it deep and narrow inside a large organization. So there's kind of like a magic number out there. If you're going to do a significant change like this, and let's say the whole company's doing waterfall and they're trying to do iterative and incremental development and Scrum, then just pick a functional area that's like 100 people or so and start there. Uh, don't try to do the whole 300,000 organization. The other thing we look at is the teams. How do we set up the teams, and what frameworks do we use? And as we know, most companies out there in the world are using Scrum. or some hybrid thereof. Many companies are using Lean and Kanban, but I think Scrum is probably the champ out there as far as a footprint. And there's a lot of scaling frameworks out there. But the notion here is we have to start with the basics. We have to get really good with the basics. The most difficult thing for many companies is defining the teams. So when we say cross-functional teams, that's not necessarily very easy for some companies to do because of their organizational technical debt as well as their architectural and software technical debt. So again, it's a journey, but we will have to define the teams, and we do want to have cross-functional teams. We look at the type of work that the team is doing, the technical infrastructure, which includes the code bases, the product and the customer and the market. And then we use all that information to kind of define the teams. And then we put together a team that helps with the transformation and the agile leadership. And we focus on things like the tools and the infrastructure and the training and the education and the mentoring and so forth. So that's generally what I see out there as a pattern. Assess the current state, determine the target state that you want to move to, pick an area inside the organization you want to do this massive change with, and then set up the teams and define them in the organizational structure, which includes the product organization, and then set up a transformation or an agile adoption team that's going to help and support this transformation. Any questions, or anyone wants to share what their experience? I mean, and we're going to go a little more detail on this, but this is kind of like a high level of what I've seen out there. Anyone want to share anything?
Hey Jay, good evening. This is Krishna Prasad here.
Hi.
Quick question. So you mentioned 200 plus team of teams. So you mean this is the entire organization size, or are you really talking about this 200 plus team members working as one large team?
No, and I'll go into some examples, some concrete examples of companies where we've done this. So one of the companies, it's a large bank, and their desire and their intent was for this functional area, this digital area, is they didn't know at the time that there was going to be 200 plus teams, but they said we want to change and move to Agile and do Scrum and set up Scrum teams. We really believe this is the right thing to do. And then when we sat down and started organizing things and looking at the structures, all of a sudden we started to realize, holy moly, this is going to turn into 150 to 200 teams by the time we're all done. So the secret here is, I hope everyone agrees on the phone, you can't snap your fingers and onboard and create 200 teams. It takes a while. So it took us about a year and a half, 2 years to get those teams up and running and proficient in Scrum, if you will. But it ended up being 200 teams. And there's a couple other organizations talk about where we did the same. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, sure. Okay. And
Hey,
sorry,
Jay.
one more question.
Sure.
So you talk about this transformation team leadership. So my own experience is, like initially it starts off with some external consulting, kind of guys coming in, but we also try to onboard some of the people from within the organization and make it like a joint team. Is that always the right approach?
Right. Oh, absolutely. And I really firmly believe that if a large company is serious about this, they should be hiring full-time people to do it. I mean, you might get the consultants or a firm to come in there and get you going and starting, but you're really, in my opinion, you need to have people there that are part of your culture, part of your organization that's going to sustain this transformation and move it to other parts of your company. So I strongly recommend that they hire full-time people to do that. Is it?
Hey,
Mhm. Go ahead.
oh, I didn't want to step on Krishna Prasad's questions. Krishna Prasad, are you good? Can I
Yes,
ask
yes.
mine?
Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, Jay. This is
Mm.
Gopal. One of the things I was thinking of was maybe this is an undercurrent or a platform across all of these different, three different pieces that you have laid out, is the cultural piece of the organization, which
Mhm.
also ties into the what we call the business agility and the metrics piece as well. So I don't know if you know you want to elaborate a little bit on that. Maybe it's part of the first box, maybe it's part of the first and the second boxes, whatever, as well.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. I got a couple of slides we can talk about that, but when we do org change, that is part of the culture. So I don't know if how many people, I don't have the slide in here that's familiar with the integral agile method or other methods out there that really take a more holistic, cohesive, and comprehensive approach where they include organizational change and cultural change. So there's a lot of thought and research out there now that culture happens through organization design and organization change. Okay, so whatever the culture you have now, and the same thing with the communication structure and processes that Conway's law indicates is what it is now. So we take a snapshot of that current state where you see over there when we do the org change. We look at the culture and the current state, and we try to identify, okay, but what are the gaps or what are some of the anti-patterns we see? Because we're gonna have to focus on those because we want to move them to the new organizational design. And through that, it's going to change their culture. So yes, we have to be prepared for that. We have to have, the typical change management stuff or cultural change stuff that goes along with any kind of organizational change. Does that make sense? So,
Yes, Jay.
cool. So let's dive a little deeper in all of this stuff. Okay. So what is organizational design? So I think all of us know what that is. And it's basically, it's more than just moving boxes around on an org chart, right? It's setting up an organization that works for your particular company and industry. So, a bank's organization design is going to be different than Amazon's organization design, right? However, the functions and the patterns and how people interact and how they communicate is where we focus on. And there's different types of organizations out there, and there's different rules, engagement rules that comes with these organizations. So a lot of us, one of the things we look at is the physical layout. So show me the org chart, show me who's reporting to who, what's the command and control, what's the authority level, and so forth. And through that, what we're really trying to find out is the politics and the political culture of the organization. And then we look at the enterprise organization. So, how is the enterprise set up? Like I said, every industry has a pretty set way of how they set up an organization. So if I go from a P&C insurance company to a P&C insurance company, the organization design is similar. I mean, it's not exactly the same. If I go from one retail bank to the next retail bank, is their organization design is pretty much the same, right? So you'll get some notion there because they're selling products and services, and they have the necessary organization to create them and support them. And then, of course, we in Agile, we focus a lot on the team organization, and I'm going to be talking about that a lot. But I just want to mention that there's different layers of organizational structure that we have to care about too, because those influence the teams approaches. And there's three models we'll go through: the functional one, the projects and program ones, and the matrix ones. And then there's one here I didn't list, which is the product organizational structure, which we'll talk about too. So this is a organizational design taxonomy. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Frederick Laloux, But he had this whole notion that there's different levels of an organization, and he had these colors that you see here that would indicate the level of the organization's ability to be adaptable and their ability to basically do good for society and do good for the planet. And not surprisingly, most companies are for profit, right? Okay, so their number one thing is profit. Now you start in the last few years, you've seen that change with advertisements and how companies are doing. They're promoting and they're investing more in social improvements and world improvements, climate change and so forth. So they want to be known as a good social citizen. But behind that, I suspect that they think that they're going to get more customers or retain more customers, hence more revenue. So that's what's called the kind of orange model in the LaLue framework. And very few companies in the world ever get to the teal where they're adaptive organization. There's this whole notion out there that you can't have organizations that you can adapt and change. So I was at IBM for like 20 years, and we always made fun that every 6 months or every year the organization will change, but most of us would never get impacted by it, right? And I think a lot of companies go through that kind of change all the time. People coming in and going and changing organizations and trying to adapt to the new the new environment that we live in right now, which is very volatile, and we have to apply and change based on that. So I'm not going to talk about sociocracy and holeocracy too much this time around. Those have been popular for a while. There's some companies who have done this. There's a couple of companies that basically have no management. There's no managers in the company, but these are rare breeds in the world. There's very few of these type of companies that operate. Most of these most companies out there operate in a typical manner that we're used to for profit companies. Very command and control. Okay, very hierarchical. Right? A lot of matrix organizations out there. Does anyone else have any other experiences besides that? Well, that's my experience and based on my readings. So first thing most companies do is they organize by function, right? And we have purchasing function, a marketing function, a sales function. We have technology or IT is a function. Right, and we have managers, and we have this whole span of control and people. And you have HR and have HR managers and so forth, and you have different levels of people, executives, and so forth, and it's very functional. Now, one of the most successful companies in the world is still organized this way, and it's very functional. Does anyone know what that company is? Take a guess. It's one of the most successful companies in the world. It's Apple. Apple still is organized by function. And when they hire people, experts in a certain area, like the Apple iPhone camera, the person that runs that group is very knowledgeable and expert in that space in lenses and cameras, and his whole team is, for example, and it's very functional. Now, big companies, how many of you out there work for big companies? They go from functional to divisional. So now all of a sudden they start having divisions. Oh, we have a European division, we have a US division, or they can have divisions by customers, okay, or market divisions. But this is just, once they get to a certain size, they start now creating this additional layer of structure. How many of how many on the phone work for a large company like this who has divisions? And underneath the divisions have functional areas. No one? This is, yeah, if you ever work for a big, Fortune 100, 200 company, you'll be part of that. IBM, for example, is a very heavily matrixed organization. So not only do they have the divisions and the functions, but then we have managers who go across different areas. And here it says projects. It could be, it could be products too. And it's all matrixed. And so I have a manager that I report to, but when I'm working on something, I also have to report to two or three other people that are specifically on the engagement or project or whatever I'm working on. So this is a very popular organizational structure. And then these are the two major paradigms out there. How many of you are working for a company who is moving to or is already organized by product? In Northern California, there's a lot of startups and software companies who organize by product. And if you look at most of these companies, they're either organized over here this way, or you have the whole area supporting a product and set of customers, and they have different organizational structures here, right? Or they have the functional layer up here, and then they have the product where they pick people from these different functional areas to be on a cross-functional team for product A, product B, product C, who has their own set of customers and customer journey. You're probably saying, well, Jay, why are you talking about all this stuff? Well, remember at the very beginning, I said one of the things we do is we want to assess what kind of organization they have and culture, because that's going to help us determine how we're going to get these teams up and operational and create cross-functional teams. So when I create cross-functional teams in this world, it's going to be different than when I create them in this world over here. Similarly, if I have this world to deal with, how I create cross-functional teams is going to be very complicated. Okay, this world, it's going to be way down deep inside the functional areas of each division, but I have to worry about, okay, do I have to have a team here that's writing code or providing business services and so forth that crosses the European and US division? How does that work, right? And it's the same thing here. If I have a very functional design one, this is probably the most simple one. I would just have a team that does this R&D, or a team that just does the iPhone lens or the iPhone camera, right? And that team is that's all it does, is that's the function that I deal with. Once I determine that, then I can look at the organizational heuristics, which is to some extent the culture. Based on their organizational design, I would have to develop with a team, collaboration, the target operating model and the approach or the plan to get to the target operating model. So let's say I have a team, but they're not product oriented, they're project oriented. So let's go here. I have a team, projects. We fund things by projects. We organize people around projects. Once the project is over, the people are dispersed and they go to the next project that we fund. Okay, I want to move them to an agile organization, an agile enterprise that's product centric. To move from a project centric to a product centric, and it doesn't matter if it's this one, this functional one, or this product heavy one here, I have to figure out the plan to do that. So depending on which one they're in, the functional one or the product heavy one, the plan is going to be different. So if this is my target to go to this model, I would have a different plan of getting there than a target to go to this model, and the journey would be different. Does that make sense to everyone? And then we would have to also then align the customer journey and the customer to the organizational structure. The other thing we need to look at when we assess everything is the culture, is the leadership style. So like I said, most large organizations are very hierarchical, very political, and they have a type of leadership style that's probably not a good fit for the agile way of thinking and the agile way of working and creating self-managed autonomous teams. So part of that is ascertaining their leadership style and then determining how we're going to use the Tuckman stages of forming, storming, norming, performing, which is iterative and parallel, and then how we implement situational leadership and how we implement things like coaching and consulting versus command and control. So this is also included in this whole thing of how do I get 200 teams up and running. I have to think about all of this stuff because I've got to deal with the people and the current culture. You can't change culture or organization overnight. You can start and you take, bite-sized pieces, I guess. There's a lot of canvases out there you can use to help do this, where you can map, the products and the teams, and a lot of people do product canvases. We do customer journey mapping and canvases. We do team structure canvases and so forth to try to align the stars, if you will. And then believe it or not, there's a CMMI model for product as well that you can use. And this then helps you say, okay, for each one of these areas, and the integral agile model or approach is same. You'd look at the processes, the people, the organizational leadership and tools, and you try to figure out how you're going to change pieces of each one of those things as you go along the journey, which is going to influence how you can set up your teams. Because some of this basic stuff, you have to get consensus on the change and the basic organizational structure before you start just setting up a bunch of Scrum teams. So let's talk about the Agile Working Group. So that's the organization, everything I just went through. Okay, and helping define it, working with the leaders to determine the teams in the technology or IT world, working with the product, which is the business side of the house generally. It's how do we work together? How do we formulate these teams? If we're going to go Scrum, then how are we going to identify product owners and product managers? And how are we going to identify Scrum masters and the delivery teams? And how are we going to organize it? I got to look at the code base. I got to look at the organizational structure. And I can't change everything overnight. So sometimes we have to take interim steps. So the people that help the company work through all that and make decisions is called the Agile Working Group or the Agile Transformation Team or the Agile Adoption. I've seen 100 different names for this team. Anyone else names that you've heard or seen for this group?
You said they are not the agile PMO, right? Because some companies use agile PMO.
Yeah, it could be the same. I think one of the things I struggle with a lot of companies is that this team is part of the PMO. Okay, so so I already have a lot of bias of project manager, program manager. And hey, I used to be one. So in the Agile world, in the Scrum world, in the Kanban world, and as in SAFe and LESS, we'll talk about in a minute, there's really, well, SAFe does have it, but there's not a lot of room for the old project management and program management way of thinking, way of working. Now, know how many PMI or project managers I have on the call, but PMI is changing. And they're moving more towards Agile and their whole PMP and everything. So it's pretty interesting. So, but this is generally a team and of Agile experts, you know, Agile coaches or whatever, that have done this before and helped organizations or this group of inside the organization to transform to being Agile, right? And
so Jay, sorry,
mhm.
just one more,
Sure.
one more question. Sorry to interrupt.
No,
But
good.
nowadays, we are also seeing some trend of this working group being part of the overall quality organization, which I'm
Oh,
personally, kind of not at all in favor. But it looks like a lot of companies are doing that. I don't know
wow.
what your opinion is.
Well, that's new to me. I have not seen that too much yet. Where it was you're talking about the tech QA group leading it?
It's like the overall quality management, quality process
Oh,
organization.
oh. Yeah, GE was big about that back in the day. Uh, TQM and they had a whole quality group and they were big in, you know, being black belts in God, I just forgot the name of it now. That whole
Six Sigma.
thank you. God, I purposely forgot that in my life. So yes. So yeah, so that's new for me. I have not seen that. But you know, my opinion, and I know a lot of people disagree with me, but at this juncture, if I have leaders inside the organization and they want to do this, I would help them. Now, eventually, I would want to get it out of the QA or quality management group or the PMO group and make it more of, you know, part of the business leadership and the executive team, because you know that's how you really, I think, get fundamental changes inside a company. Okay, because like I said before, most companies are very hierarchical and most people, you know, if the executives say do this and they believe in it, then they follow or they go somewhere else. Uh, and I think if you're further down inside the organization, and you're trying to make these kind of substantial changes. It's not that you can't do it; it'll just be more difficult. That's been my experience. So the Agile Working Group, you know, has to come in. We'll talk about it in a minute, and they have to set up, you know, how they're going to do this. And I'm going to talk about, you know, how to set up an Agile Working Group, knowing, like I said earlier, that hey, you're going to have to stand up 100, 200 teams over a period of time. So what type of organizational structure do you have to set up to support what's about to happen? So this is kind of what we look at. So there's a transformation office, there's a coaching thing, there's a nerve center, but it's mostly the information knowledge hub. So what most companies do when they do this, and I like to hear what others people's experience is in this world, is they set up a team. And the team is going to, first of all, set up the tools, the infrastructure, Jira, Rally, whatever, and the reporting and how they're going to change that, all that stuff. And then you got to have a bunch of coaches and expert scrum masters and so forth that's going to have to do the education and training, the workshops, and then have to mentor the teams and mentor the people. And then you're going to have a knowledge center. So whether Confluent, I think someone needs to be put on mute. I can hear someone shuffling papers or eating. Um, so then you need to have somewhere to store this so that you can provide the information to people as the transformation occurs. And this is what I typically see out there. And then the other big thing to help change, you know, happen and sustain itself is to create these communities of practice, right? So you have Scrum Master community practice, product, and you have different technical ones as well. And that really helps sustain the change, because now you start building these communities of people, this communication, this relationship building, which then helps sustain and accelerate to some extent this change that we want to make. There's also, that's not on this picture, is there's also a lot of marketing and sales that goes on here, right? Because, hey, we're asking people to change, and depending on where they're at in the organization, if they're just going from, like, they've done waterfall for 30 years, and then you're going to tell them to go off and do this new way of thinking and working, that, I'm telling you, it's not going to happen overnight. Some people will be excited about it and be motivated, and they'll want to learn the new way of doing stuff. And some people will not be, and they don't want to learn it, and they don't want to change. Okay. So those dynamics you have to work with. Down at the bottom, it says change leadership team. Now, this is just to be, the change management processes and everything we used to do, from Cotter and from other groups. And then there's a lean change kind of way of doing it now. But the way we look at it now in most companies is that this is continuous. So we always have to create a learning environment and an environment that can change and adapt, because our market and our customers and our products change and adapt. So this is continuous. So we're trying to build an organization at the end of the day. An agile enterprise or an agile organization is one that can change on a dime for a dime. That's our goal. Any questions here or any sharing? Anyone wants to share based on their experience? So one of the things we try to do a lot is we try to use Agile to implement Agile. So we have these working groups. One of the things we like to do is create Kanban boards and create a backlog and everything for the Agile transformation and adoption we're going to do, right? And we want to come up with success measurements, right? And we want to be realistic, but at the same time, we want to create some, I hate to say, chaos, right? So my experience in life is that if you have a well-structured, organized project plan of how you're going to do this, it's going to change within a month or two after you started it, because that's just the way organizations are. They're very complex systems, very dynamic. Hey, we're dealing with human beings here, and market and customer changes and other constraints and pressures that's going to happen throughout this journey. So you always have to be willing to, accept some disruption and chaos. And some people are not comfortable with that. Matter of fact, I'm on an assignment now where people got upset and frustrated with me because I'm implementing, to some extent, some chaos here, because we're changing, we're transforming. And there is no perfect project plan or step-by-step, formula that you can follow. Now, we have a pattern, we have a formula like I talked about earlier, but it's the attention or the execution is in the details. So my experience is that once you get teams up and running and they learn the basics and they really get good at Scrum and how they do planning and how they cross-team planning, and they don't need you anymore. They come proficient. They can adapt. So we just got to get the people to that point. And you can see here's some examples of hubs, is what so some companies have, as anyone worked for a company where they had dojos, and where they brought people into this Agile transformation place and taught them and everything, and then they went out and did it, but they came into a central like dojo or learning lab. Anyone experience that? Well, some companies do that, like Target.
So, I saw one in Medellin, Colombia. Their dojos were dojos were coding dojos,
Ah,
and they were doing coding craftsmanship using the Gervais.
cool. Well, I know Target and State Farm. I don't know if they still do it, but they had the dojo concept where they brought the teams in. So they bring, they would bring the Scrum teams or the Kanban teams, mostly Scrum, and they would bring the product team and the product managers, and they would stay for like a week or 2 weeks or whatever the time. I think it was 5 days, and then they would learn everything, and they would go back out and do it, and they would get some coaching, right? I'm not a big fan of that. I can tell you that right now. I'm more of a fan of setting up the teams and having the coaches assigned to the teams and work with the teams to get them proficient and have some kind of coaching or plan that we would follow to get them to different levels of maturity, right? And providing the support that they need. I think the communities of practice help with that. I think, coaching cohorts or organizations, big companies have that. Practice hubs, to your point, if you have these places where you can go and practice some really cool things, and this is where product discovery and innovation really flourishes, but also technical mastery. So that'd be good if if your organization can afford to have those kind of labs, if you will. Any questions on this notion of using Agile to implement Agile? So the other thing, while we're kind of working on the teams and getting the 200 teams up and everyone getting proficient at Scrum, which takes a while, and you have to plan it accordingly. So you have to pick, you can't do all the teams at once. So this is where it's very important, that whole organizational design I talked about, and figuring a sweet spot in the organization to start this, and you gradually, incrementally grow it. It's a very important concept to implement. The other very important concept to implement as we develop these teams is to align them to the product and the customer journey. So I've seen this happen many times and read about it for a few companies where they implemented Agile well. They had Scrum teams up and running, they've implemented DevOps and stuff, but they took their eye off the customer, and they lost customers, and they lost revenue, they lost market dominance. Or one company, a bank, overlooked some fraud and AML stuff, got in trouble, and had to spend millions and millions of dollars in fines. Okay, so the purpose of this slide is when we set up these 200 teams, or to pick on this functional area or organizational area of the company to transform it to an agile way of thinking and working, do not take your eye off the customer. And generally the way we do that, we do customer journey maps, and we align the customer journey to the product and to the teams. So if I set up these teams, they are aligned to a part of the customer journey, and the decisions and the prioritizations they make on the epics and features and stories is significantly based on customers, what the customer wants, what the market needs. So it's very important that we include this as we stand up all these teams. They have to be aligned to the customer and the customer journey. So as we know, hopefully everyone on this call, we leverage, lean agile framework. So at the very beginning, some decisions has to be made. Are we going to do Scrum only? Are we going to do Scrum and Kanban? Do we need to have a playbook? Okay, so we're going to create training material for product owners and product managers and scrum masters in the team, right? We're going to have all that cool stuff. But at some point in our journey here, at the very beginning, when we start setting everything up, before we set up the teams, the decision has to be made. Okay, because if in a large organization, when you're very starting at the very beginning, when I said we introduce some levels of chaos, we have to be careful about introducing chaos that's not necessary or doesn't provide any benefit. One of those is just letting the teams willy-nilly pick whatever they want to do. And they still have to, push code to a similar code base, have the same release, the same planning across teams. It's very difficult. I'm not saying it can't be done. It's just challenging if you have, newbie people doing this, and then half of them are doing Kanban, and half of them are doing Scrum, half of them are doing Save, or a third, I should say, third, and they're all having to work together and push code to the same code bases, to the same environments. It's very challenging. So if you can get everyone to say use Scrum, and then we can adapt as we move forward. As you can see, some of the frameworks, the popular ones out there, like Safe, Scaled Agile Framework, they have an implementation roadmap. And it's like, you follow this road and your life will be good, and the company's life will be good, and you'll be agile. Well, there's no perfect anything out there. I mean, if this worked for everybody and it was perfect and every company became very successful and every employee was happy and every customer is happy throughout the world all the time, then this would be used everywhere all the time. It's not. Same thing over there when you see this other one. That's just another example of Scrum Inc.'s Scrum at Scale. And there's others out there. There's Discipline and Agile, and we'll talk about large scale Scrum in a minute. But there's a lot of these frameworks, and you have to pick what you want. I always suggest that you start with the basics. Start with Scrum and Kanban, get proficient at that, get some of your teams up and running, then consider how you're going to scale it. And you can do pieces and parts of these frameworks. If you get the right people in there that can merge and pick and choose and merge things and understand how it works, then that's also a good option.
Jay, sorry, a quick question. Previous slide. You mentioned that, yes, we need to get the basics right. And I completely agree, like the Scrum or the Kanban teams, at the agile team level, right?
Right.
But many places, I personally see, and some of the leadership team members believe that that's it. If the Scrum teams are working, then we are agile. Then the leaderships don't take responsibility to become agile themselves. But
right.
then, they just keep pushing the Scrum teams and saying, oh, we are not getting the right benefit and what is happening and so on. So how would we address that? Like,
yeah, so that's part of the Agile Transformation and plan that you got to come up with in the group. So we attack all of these try to do it in parallel. So getting the teams up and running is cool. We got to do that, but it's a team of teams. So it's the product layer, which I'll talk about in a minute, and the managers. They're a team. They got to practice certain agile ways of thinking and working, right? So does the executives. Okay, so here's an example. I'm at a company now and they're moving into agile, they're doing Scrum and everything, and the technical leaders just send out a dictum to everyone that they want to increase the velocity for this set of teams by 15%. Okay, that's their goal. And my immediate reaction is, no, that's an anti-pattern. We don't do that, right? But the leadership and the managers, even though they were trained on this, they thought that was a lever they could pull. So even though they went through training, this is what I'm trying to say, these people that are in charge and are managing still need coaching to say, no, there's other ways you can get better performance and productivity out of your teams, but that's not the way, right? So we need to educate them and coach them. We also need to, at some point in time, especially if you're getting 200 teams like we're talking about, you need that layer inside the organization that makes decisions and prioritizes work, so work intake process, that comes into the teams, right? And because a lot of these teams that we work with in these big companies, especially shared services teams, have a lot of internal stakeholders and a lot of requests for work. Okay, and they might be 1 or 2 levels away from the customer, interfacing directly with the customer, right? So it's very important then that we create that leadership level, which I'll talk about in a minute. We generally look at L4 through L1, but that L2 and L3 level, which is important, they have to be created. So that's when you start then thinking about how do we scale this, right? Because it's not just the delivery teams, the Scrum and Kanban teams, but now I have this product layer team or this leadership team that has responsibilities. And in some organizations, they also have to create, epics and features and prioritize the features, and the features feed the Scrum or to some extent you could do this, the Kanban team. So that layer has to be thought through of how you want to do that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
So we're going to talk more about that, actually. So Scaled Agile Framework, I think now we're talking about, okay, let's just assume you got the Scrum teams up and running and they're humming. Okay, everything's good. I mean, they're not perfect. You're never going to be perfect, okay? Now you're going to say, okay, it's time to scale, right? Because now we got 20 of our teams up. Now we're going to move to 30. Our goal is we're going to have 200 teams, right? Okay, well, we looked at the organization, we did organization design and structure, and we kind of know how all this kind of aligns, right? And we know who the senior leaders are and the decisions they're going to have to make. So now, say, for example, it's not my most popular framework to use, but I like parts of it, and I have experience implementing it. However, one of the things we look at is when we start to scale things is okay, what group of people, what organization or part of the organization is going to make those decisions and feed the teams. And SAFe is a very proper one. It has the largest footprint out there as far as scaling frameworks go. But I would argue that most companies take this and customize it for their needs. And it has different levels that you can pick from to implement SAFe as well. But the neat thing about SAFe, it really doesn't require significant lean organization change. What I mean by lean, I mean cutting levels of your organization out. Okay. It doesn't require that like large scale Scrum does, which we'll talk about in a minute. But this then allows you, to your point, to scale. Now, the hard part about scaling in any organization, in my experience, is that people that are not used to working like this are now having to do that. Some people are used to having people reporting to them, and they do reports or HR, or they tell people what to do or whatever it is. They're just used to working in this manager type of role. Now, all of a sudden, they become a product manager or something like that. They have to make decisions, they have to go to meetings, and they have to write things like epics, for example. Well, some people may not want to do that. So there is a impact to roles and responsibilities inside an organization if you're going to move to this agile way of working and organizational structure. So just keep that in mind. SAFe kind of talks through that and walks through all of those different things that you can do. And you can customize it for your needs. Large scale Scrum from a scaling framework is a little bit different than SAFe. It's a lot different. So they really believe that you have to have fundamental organizational change. And they really believe in leaning out the organization. They believe that the product owner has all the authority for financing, for budget, for making decisions, team. They do all the prioritization of all the work that comes to teams. And there's a less huge too, where they have area product owners for scaling. But they don't believe in a significant hierarchy organizational structure. They try to lean it out as much as possible. Now you got to realize that Craig Larman and Boss Fody, come from a software engineering background, and their framework is more around software engineering and how to improve and optimize software engineering and technology. Whereas SAFe is more around how do I optimize a large organizational hierarchy. Okay, so it goes all the way up to the CEO and the enterprise and the portfolio vision and the products and the investments and so forth. And then it finally gets down to teams where they might be doing some software engineering. And now what's happening in a lot of companies are taking Scrum and Kanban and everything, and they're moving it into the business domain of the organization where there is no software output. And they're using those practices and techniques to optimize how their business operations runs and their process and their flows. But less is more about organizational change. So what the purpose of why I'm bringing up these frameworks, you've got to pick the framework. If I'm going to stand up 200 teams and I look at the organization and culture, I got to pick the framework that's going to work at this point in time. So if the executives and the leaders aren't ready to make significant organizational change and have significant changes in the leanness of their organization and give the product owners this much power to make financial decisions and stuff, well, this is not going to work right off the bat. I might have to customize it. And maybe there's an interim model I go to if we're going to move to that target model. Any questions on that? Finally, do not forget Conway's law. So Conway, those on the phone probably know about this. It's more about communication, and the organizational communication sometimes is reflected on our code base and our software architecture. And in my experience, I've seen that a lot. I've walked into companies, and I looked at their software architecture and if their componentry, if you will, and I look at their organizational hierarchy and their organizational structure and managers and their communication and decision, and I can see a one-to-one connection. I don't know. Does anyone else on the call have that experience?
Absolutely.
So, yeah, so I always ask the question, if I was a pure agile company and I was going to more cloud, if you are hybrid cloud, enablers type stuff, shared services, but feature teams, if I looked at the application architecture and infrastructure, software architecture, would it mirror how I've organized my Scrum teams, my cross-functional teams, and my organizational structure? I'm curious. I've not gone back to companies and said, okay, we've changed everything and looked at their software architecture and see if we ever changed that, right? A lot of times we don't, right? But it's kind of cool, I think, if I see we did. And a lot of companies are moving to the cloud and doing all that stuff, and I think that's representative of that. But I wonder, did anyone on the call actually see where we moved more to an agile organizational structure and way of working, and then you actually saw the software architecture and everything change to map to that? I'm just curious.
I think you can see the old architecture get in the way of making organizational changes because the organization mapped to the architecture, to the old architecture. It's hard to make organizational changes when it maps to an older architecture.
Right. But have you seen it where you've made the change and then the architecture changed and then it was more adaptive and conforms more to an agile organization? Have you seen that?
Slowly. Slowly.
Yeah, and it is a journey and it's an evolution, right? So a lot of times, you know, in my experience, I go into organizations, teams, and I see that they're scrumming. And some of the funniest things I've seen is I've talked to people and they go, yeah, we're agile or scrum. We have daily stand-ups and we use Jira. We're agile. I went, okay, cool. But at the end of the day, I'm going like, well, okay, cool. What's the outcome? So, you know, what's your baseline to begin with before you started this agile journey? Once you got to a certain point in the journey, did you take a checkpoint and see if your business outcomes, your customer outcomes, your employees' outcomes, your employees' happiness, whatever, has that gotten better? Right? I always try to map the change we're making and all these cool practices and tools and automation we're doing to some measurable outcome that we want to see, right? Increase revenue, increase customer acquisition, increase customer retention, you know, increase employee happiness or employee engagement and retention, but whatever it is. I like doing that, but does anyone else do that on the call?
I think that's one of the big pitfalls in any transformation, kind of journey. If we don't measure the outcomes, or at least if the leadership is not clear on the expected outcomes, then I think there will be a lot of friction. Teams think they are achieving something, whereas the leadership, thinks completely otherwise. So it's a mismatch in the kind of outcome expectations and also not measuring outcomes at the right time.
Right, which is very important.
Yeah.
So now there's a whole nother interesting dynamic that's going on. And we call this an ambidextrous organization. So and every company feels this. So we have to spend money and focus our time on what some people call business as usual or keep the lights running or whatever. But it's to keep our current systems up and running and our current customers happy. And we make some, tweaks here and there, enhancements here and there, right? Oh, hold on, y'all. I gotta go answer the door. I'll be right back. Oh, there's a perfect example of being adaptive. That was UPS. I had to go grab something. Sorry. So, ambidextrous, so here's the deal. And this, I think a lot of companies struggle with this. So they have to make investment decisions. So they get work coming in. How much time or money do I spend on pure innovation? And how much time and money do I need to spend on keeping things running, right? And a lot of companies try to magically come up with a percentage. We're going to do 50-50 or 60-40 or whatever. This has to be included in the decisions on how we formulate our teams. So I think in my experience, and I've heard this by many people, and I've seen this tried by many companies, they try to use the same team that's keeping the application up and running, fixing defects, maintenance, enhancement, to also do major product creation or change, or write something brand new, code-wise, or move everything to the cloud and write everything from scratch to the cloud, the same team. And I have not seen that work very successfully. Has anyone seen that work successfully?
So what gets in the way? Is it that it requires more people? It requires a team that's too large to do both things?
I think so, because think about it. So Scrum says 10 or less people, right? And I've got a backlog. So here's what we could do. All right, I have this brand new thing I'm coding and building, right? I got, 200 stories. But then I have, 300 stories, and some of it's defects, to keep the old system, if you will, running. Okay. So now I'm going to prioritize the work for my sprint, 2-week sprint. Okay. So I'm going to pick keep the old system running defect, and some of the new stuff to build, right? My thinking and experience is that if I had this same team, 10 people, let's say I had 3 teams, and each of them had 9 or 10 people, it would take me a long time to get the new thing built, because 50 or 40% of their time is spent on keeping the old thing running. Does that make sense?
So so if we have 30 people total, we could divide it so that one team is doing maintenance, and over the course of the year they all quit because they hate doing maintenance.
Right.
And so now we've only got 20 people, or we could have 3 teams of 10, and each one of them owns a feature area that includes both the new version and the maintenance. And conceivably we'll get to the same point, but nobody quits because they're working on new stuff in addition to maintenance.
Exactly.
That's one theory.
Yeah,
That's one theory.
Yeah.
I agree with Ron completely, because we have also tried this in the past where certain teams are dedicated only to bug fixes and some minor stuff, and there is already this so-called elitism which is built into another team which is working only on new features. So their incentive is to develop features with as many bugs as possible, because there is another team which can always fix the bugs.
Right.
So that I think is breeding a bad culture. And somehow the challenge of managing new work versus the technical debt, I think it's part of the same team's responsibility.
Right. So did I forget to mention one other complication? The other complication is this is a new skill set and technology that none of the team members have experience doing, like AI or machine learning or cloud Kubernetes. So then the question I always say, look, we're supposed to have a learning organization, right? We're supposed to have persistent, long-lived teams, right? So then we have to come up with a learning plan, a growth plan for our team members, right? So then you can bring in mentors and coaches to teach them the AI and ML. They can go to class, right? And they can become proficient doing that over time, just like they did with Scrum, right? So that I've seen that work, but I guess the only thing I've seen kind of not work, and it was challenging for some companies, is that the leadership, the managing executives, wanted the solution sooner or faster than if we did it the way that I think all on the call would want to do, right? Is to keep the persistent teams, train them up, learn them, may take a little longer, right? And it gets done. So what some big companies do, they'll just hire a firm to come in and build it all up and then transfer the knowledge and train up their current people, and they'll hire additional people that will maintain it. I've seen that happen 1,000 times.
And a ton of people quit because the executive team is honoring handing it off to some consulting organization instead of trusting their employees.
Right. And I think the big deal here that I see that we just have to figure out how to optimize this model is that, remember, we have customers and we have a market and we have competition and disruption. So sometimes speed to market is important, but sometimes speed to market will kill you because you spend too much time on that, right? But at the same time, it's a balancing act because I got to get something new and fresh out there so I can keep my customers, or my customers are going to go to the other cool company that has better and fresh stuff, right, at cheaper prices. So if I can do that with the model that we just talked about and get it out in a reasonable amount of time so I can stay competitive or take away customers, then that would be cool.
Now, there's another
Yeah,
problem. There's another
Other
problem.
dimension.
There's another problem we're
Sorry,
not
Ron.
dealing with. There's another problem we're not dealing with here, which is what we're talking about is replatforming or recoding, creating a new version of what we've already got.
Mm-hmm.
And if and our executives say, oh, what we really want that new version right away. But while we're working on that new version, the executives come back and say, but we have to have new features in the old version while we're doing this, because that's going to take a while.
Right.
And with the result that the worst possible estimate that we ever made for the new version, we need to multiply that by 3.
Right.
Yeah. So I want to add another dimension to this bug fixing versus new product development. So that's the cost dimension, right? So from a bug fixing perspective, usually in an organization, what I've seen is that you put the team that would be working on the bug fixes, and the total cost of that organization is much smaller than a new product development, which would be based on newer technologies or updating, the architecture and design and things like that. So it would be much more senior people versus people who are doing production support. So that's another dimension that we should not forget.
Yeah.
So I want to throw in a counterpoint to that,
Mm-hmm.
which is the team that built that new application that has all those bugs in it and left all those bugs for that other team. The bugs they left are the hardest bugs. That team that should be fixing those bugs should be the more senior team, because the bugs are the ones that the more senior team left because they didn't want to fix them.
Yes and no, Ron. I understand it depends on the time of the transition to the junior team that is doing the bug fixes. So if you're looking at a time scale where you just add a feature and then anything that is a beta escape goes into the junior team, then I agree with you. But on the other hand, if you're supporting a product at least a few quarters and it stabilizes and then you have to scale it, and then you are moving the stabilized code to the team, which is a lower cost, that's a totally different issue. So I would say it's a time scale issue there as well.
True. So Chris was calling out the fact that we might build, if we've got a separate team that's building from the team that's doing bugs, the team that's building will spawn a bunch of bugs because they don't have to fix them.
Right.
Yeah, agreed. That shouldn't be the case. They should be rewarded for a stable product, not for just pushing some code out.
Yeah, and I could tell you, based on my life experiences in the 90s, 80s and 90s, that there was a different set of thinking of software engineers. So there were software engineers that built and created stuff, and there were software engineers that maintained stuff. And there was a different capability and skill set, and none of them would mix or intertwine. So sometimes the maintenance people, this is the way we thought, right or wrong. We said, yeah, they can't create stuff, and they're not good at creating new development, figuring out, how to design stuff or how to do really complicated algorithms and coding because they've never done it. They just don't have the ability to do it. Oh, therefore they're going to fix bugs and maintenance. And then, like Ron said, well, some of the bugs and stuff are really, really hard and complicated to do, right? So we used to have this notion that we would have two sets. And Ron, I don't know if you've experienced this in the 90s and 80s and 90s, of software engineers, right? And then we would hire accordingly and get those people onboarded that would either to create brand new cool stuff and figure stuff from scratch that know what you can't learn it from anybody because nobody's done it before. And then you have the people that can maintain what currently exists, and they can go through the software re-engineer and fix bugs and maintain stuff. I don't know, Ron, if you've experienced that.
Yeah, I will to Gopal's point say that there are occasionally software engineers who what they like to do is fix bugs. If I can get those people onto, if I can find those people and get those people onto a team, I'm going to be happy about that that way of structuring it. What I worry about is having a bug fixing team that, we feel like second-class citizens and they pay us less.
Right.
And we'll figure this out far enough to get some good kudos, and then we'll find somebody who will pay us more and leave with the corporate knowledge of how the thing actually works, as opposed to how the team that built it thought it worked.
Right. And that's the crux of this. That's why I'm bringing this up, this innovation piece versus the BAU piece. I think the quality of human beings and individuals that have skills and capabilities, there's no difference. It's just as hard to do either one, right? And I think people are human beings that can do both and do it well and serves the needs that they're assigned to or want to be assigned to at the time is great, because that's what we want to do. We want to build teams that are autonomous and self-managing and can figure stuff out on their own and support each other. And then we want management and executives to support that and provide a psychologically safe environment, a learning environment, and so forth, so that everyone can grow and be productive. So I agree. That's the agile enterprise that I would like to work for, and that's the software engineering team that I would like to be part of. So that's why I throw this out, that this is part of the equation when you build your teams. You have to structure your teams for today and for the near future, and to some extent the long-term future of what your vision is, which may change. Does that make sense to everyone? So to summarize, and I'll go through some examples of some companies here really quick. We kind of defined the organization level. We started the team, that's the L1, that's the Scrum teams, and you have the L2, which is the team above the Scrum team, which then for larger organizations, when you look at scaling, they do the work intake process and prioritization and so forth. Then once you get to the L3 and L4 level, which I didn't mention here, then now you're at the investment level for the company. You're in a business unit. You're making business decisions and investment decisions on what we just talked about. I'm going to invest so much in innovation, new stuff, brand new. So I'm going to move stuff to the cloud. I'm going to invest so much in maintaining this, but I'm going to sunset this application this year. So those are the decisions that are made at that L3 and L4 level. And to me, those are all teams of teams. Even the C-level people is a team, right? Then then once we define the L1 and L2 organization, we generally start with the L1s, we create the team rosters, right? So this is now going through the organization structure, creating the teams. If you're doing Scrum, it's 10 or less as a cross-functional team. How many QA people do you need, coders do you need, what type of application software or language we're using, where are we building, is it cloud, is it Java, so forth, etc. How is the team going to work together? What's the code base? What's the CI/CD? All that cool stuff goes into building the team roster. Meanwhile, this Agile leadership group, is coming up with some playbook, of the framework decision we talked about, aligning the customer journey and the product to it, the tools infrastructure. Are we using Jira, Rally, or using Excel spreadsheets, right? With the pandemic, we can't just, well, I guess you could stick stuff on the wall and then do Zoom and show it to everybody. We have to talk about the organizations. I went through a lot about that and how are we going to do that and lean it. Roles and responsibilities. If I'm moving a team or an organization that's been doing waterfall forever, and we start talking about product owners and product managers and scrum masters and this and that, they're gonna go, what's that? So we're gonna have to spend a lot of time on roles and responsibilities. Work intake and flow optimization and process, how we manage the decisions we make and the work through the teams and the planning. Outcome-based, OKRs, how we're going to measure success, all that cool stuff. And then divide and execute learning workshops. So that includes communities of practice and so forth. And then communicate, and mentor. And that's basically the formula and pattern I've used over the years. Here's some examples. So this was a large bank. One area of the large bank, and we kind of came through and we kind of came up with a roadmap of what we're going to do. And you can see we talked about the framework, the adoption team, and the DevOps implementation and cloud. This is at Delta. We did kind of sort of the same thing there. Came up with the different teams, and then we had the team of teams, and we kind of went to the organization structure to develop that. In IBM, we did it in many different areas, including a software group, and GBS and the backend systems. This one large infrastructure work we did at IBM. We created several Scrum teams. You can see them across the world, and organized them. And we took metrics, baseline metrics, to see what our success criteria would be, and if we hit it. It was very financially oriented, and we were very successful. But setting up those teams was difficult, I can tell you that, and how the teams would work with each other and how to educate and train them across the globe. Pepsico, we did the same thing, but there, we were very design thinking approach. So when we organized the teams, we took that into consideration because of what we were doing was oriented around that a lot, and the customer. As you can see, we had roadmap, we used Agile. All of these, we used Agile to implement Agile. Nationwide Insurance, we did the same thing now. They're very DevOps focused, so they've kind of advanced their maturity level. So like Microsoft is very DevOps organized and focused, and so is Nationwide Insurance right now, but we went through the same journey for several years, and they're more mature now. State Farm, similarly, they're the ones that, I don't know if they still do it, but they had dojos, and they would bring people in and train them. They would have coaches out in the field as well. And we would have a very design architecture oriented at State Farm. American Express, same way. We did started out simple with teams, did some scaling now. As far as I know, Amex is a big safe shop right now, and they're doing a lot of that. But when we first started out, it was just very, very Scrum oriented and Scrum teams, and then a thin layer of product leadership making prioritization decisions. And then Amex, they're still going. I mean, they're always evolving. So they have these different journey scales that they're doing in evolution. And there's some helpful references. Cool. So everything I just talked about has to be considered when it comes to people. So all those out there probably know that Google with Project Aristotle, as well as others, have determined that teams and organizational psychological safety.
I found some web
critical.
results. I can show them if you ask again from your iPhone.
That's my iPod. Cool. So that's important to consider. So even though you've got the 200 teams up and running, it's you have to be constantly vigorous to make sure that people are well taken care of. Changes are always going to happen. There's always going to be challenges, and you have to create a psychological safe environment, and have the teams create their own high-performing teams and organizations. And the Hay McBear, leadership is important as we move to more of an agile enterprise, and agile leader comes with agile leadership, right? So that's important to move away from that type of command and control and yelling at people. I can remember back in the day, I've been in conference rooms and meetings where people yelled at each other and said awful things. And I'm hopefully we've moved away from that. So that's all I have. Any sharing anyone wants to do, or anything else anyone wants to talk about?
I would say, Jay, the amount of material you covered today is equivalent to almost a 1 year of coursework in a university.
No test, though.
Are you grading on the curve?
Yeah, everyone gets an A. Just because you had to listen to me. Yeah, so so I'm opening it up. Anyone wants to have any conversations or ask any questions? I'm gonna give us a couple more minutes, and then we'll end it for tonight.
I agree with Gopal. I think the material you put together is phenomenal. So it was a good, collection, I would say, like, the transformation journey and some of the case studies which you just, highlighted. So yeah, thank you very much for sharing such wonderful information.
You're welcome. So we're going to have more. I don't think we don't have another speaker lined up yet, but Ron and Gopal will help get someone else lined up for the next few months, and we're going to continuously have these conversations and discussions and sharing. So if nothing else, I want to thank everyone for joining us. Hopefully we all learned something, and we're going to have some more of these cool events and get some more smarter people to talk besides me and introduce some ideas and subjects. So thank you all very much for joining.
Hey, Jay, there is a question on the chat window.
Oh, okay, cool. I forgot, I should look at that. Forgot all about that. When you're speaking, you forget to do this stuff.
Hard to multitask.
Which one? This one here from Michael?
Yeah.
So I didn't see a separation, but maybe it was more prevalent in IT than new product development. Thank you.
Oh, he was asking
I
more
think
about
the
the metrics
metrics.
on the examples.
Oh,
The next guy.
specific corporate example share. Can you share anything about metrics? Yeah, well, I can tell you, and I see this still today, but when we first started, we were measuring metrics that I thought at the time were cool and important, like velocity and predictability and all that stuff. The more I do this, the less I think of those metrics, to be honest with you. Now I'm more concerned about, well, what's the success measurements? What's the outcome measurements? What's the objectives and key results, right? So now, for example, when we write epics and everything, I really push for the business value, the outcome measurement that we want, and so forth. And then once we're done and we move it to the production, and let's go find out from our customers. Hey, did we meet the outcomes, right? So in the early days, those ones I shared before, a lot of it was more financial. Oh, we're going to do this Agile and Scrum things, but we want X amount improvement in cost. We want to reduce our cost by X, which basically means people. Okay. We want it's always around operational costs and operational optimization. All those ones I showed you before. Just recently, I'm starting to see companies move away from that and say, oh, well, what are the benefits? What's the customer and market benefit and success measurements or metrics that we're going to get out of it? What are the outcomes? And I think I see this as a new phenomena out there, and I'm seeing more companies doing that. I don't know if anyone else has. Like the IBM one, it was all, I'll just tell you, I worked for IBM for years, they're all bean counters. So it's all, are you going to reduce the cost? That was, and Agile did prove that we could reduce the cost and get things done faster. If we get things done faster, it reduces the cost, okay? So that was their main metric.
Yeah, as long as we don't care about the user experience, that's worth, that. What else would you measure?
Right. And Amazon and Bezos and them, they're famous for, they make all their decisions based on the customer. Is this going to improve the customer experience? Is this going to improve the getting us more customers? Is this going to improve the market over here in St. Louis with their customers, right? And if you can't prove that, and they go through this lengthy process to do this, right? And they look at so what they do is they look at what the outcome should be, what the final thing should be, and they work backwards. And they try to justify everything. And if you can't justify it and prove that, then you get no money to do it. So that's different. All right, y'all, I'm gonna end our wonderful time together this evening and thank everyone for joining, and we'll see you again next month. We'll figure out who's going to talk, and we'll let everyone know, and I'll send the recording out tomorrow along with the other one. All right.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you, Jay.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.